August 6th is Hiroshima Day. It marks the day when in 1945, towards the end of the Second World War, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima in Japan. Over 100,000 people died in that city alone, and tens of thousands of more people died in Nagasaki 3 days later. After these atomic bombs, a lot of people hoped for, worked for, dreamed of an age, dreamed of a planet when there would be no nuclear weapons. However, as we know today, that has definitely not been the case. There are in fact 13,000 nuclear weapons today. We'll be discussing this and more issues related to it in this episode of Mapping Faultlines. We are with us Prabir Purkayastha. Prabir, so of course we talk about Hiroshima Day every year almost on NewsClick on August 6th. And this time the day is also being marked as countries around the world have gathered to review the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The UN Secretary General in fact saying that we are one miscalculation away, one misunderstanding away from total nuclear annihilation. So I think at this point a question a lot of people have is that considering we know what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the scale of discussion, the photos, they became public all over the world, a huge anti-war, anti-nuclear weapon movement came out of it. How is it that even today at this point we are still in a place where the Secretary General actually is forced to say something like this?
Well, the problem that we now have is the other one. Not having destroyed ourselves for the last 75 years and more, there is a sense that, okay, nuclear weapons are dangerous, but really nobody is going to use them. So again, the issue is that we have one mistake, one miscalculation, particularly when there is tension and there is a kind of war scenario around you, then one small mistake can lead to a nuclear exchange. This is not something that I'm saying which is new. In fact, when people have gone through the records of the Cold War period, particularly say the Cuban War, certain other times, then there has been a number of instances where nuclear weapons could have been launched and were averted narrowly. Aircraft taking off from the US, ships, submarines, thinking they've got the nuclear war command from Russia, Soviet Union at that time. It was actually just a few human beings who stopped this from happening. And again, there have been a number of false alarms where a flock of geese, the moon has been mistaken for a nuclear launch. So all of this, even though we know all of this, in spite of that, there is a complete belief that nuclear exchange by mistake will not happen. And even if countries have nuclear weapons, they're not going to use them. This is, I think, the biggest problem, that unless people are willing from both sides, all sides, to say we'll give up nuclear weapons, this proliferation, as it is called, will only continue. Because people have also noticed, in fact, that North Korea wasn't attacked because it has nuclear possibilities, did have for quite some time.
Right.
But for instance, Iraq was. This, for a lot of people, is important. Yugoslavia was. So they have taken the wrong message that it is actually a protection. And that's also the problem, that therefore proliferation, more and more countries joining by creating nuclear bombs is also likely to take place. And on top of that, we have a concept which has been there right from the beginning of what is called the winnable nuclear war, that it is possible to win nuclear wars in the following way. We have a first strike, which is devastating. Then there will be a weak response because we'll have taken out most of their missiles on the first strike. And then if we have enough anti-ballistic missiles, then we can stop the weak second strike. Even if a few get through, as Curtis LeMay, the US general, was fond of saying, that's a price worth paying. And he's the one who is the general in the famous film, How I Start Loving the Bomb.
Right.
Okay, how I stopped worrying and started loving the bomb. So Curtis LeMay was saying, well, that's a price we are willing to pay. Who is willing to pay, of course, is a different issue. So this is the context within which we are discussing. And there are the immediate context, of course, the Ukraine war, in which Russia has also said that if their existence is threatened, they'll use nuclear weapons. They can use nuclear weapons. And this is a position that the United States always has held. The nuclear posture document spells it out very clearly that even in a non-nuclear attack, they have the possibility of nuclear weapons being used. So they have never given a first no-use pledge, and they don't intend to. All of this also has to be seen in the background of the fact that United States is spending something like $630 billion, more than $500 billion, for modernizing its nuclear weapons for the next 10 years, which means there is a nuclear arms race that's going to take place as well as the fact that the anti-ballistic missile treaty was jettisoned in last century. The Bush and company made it formal, but it was really jettisoned even earlier. And the anti-ballistic missile treaty means that you have the possibility then of building shields. And if you build shields, then of course, more advanced weapons. This is the where arms race that then ensures that you then make better missiles. And this is exactly what has happened after the United States withdrew from the ABM treaty and made that official. And it was very clear that they were also withdrawing from the intermediate range ballistic missile treaty. Right. That with all of this, that they were preparing for perhaps a shield come first strike capabilities of a kind that therefore Russia thought they need to respond. Therefore, we have the Kinzhals and the Avangard and other kinds of missiles, which then go at much faster speeds, therefore will be able to really defeat any ABM treaty. So we are in a situation where we don't seem to have learned anything from history. And we are entering all situations where new war tensions are gathering, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in East Asia, or whether it is in West Asia. So this is the context within which we are talking about nuclear weapons. So we must all understand the precipice at which the human race is standing. But unfortunately, we have also become very blasé.
Absolutely. Prabir, in this context, of course, a lot of media coverage around it. In fact, even the UN Secretary General's speech talked about the various areas where tensions are very high. He referred to Middle East Asia. There were, for instance, references to North Korea. But like you said, many of these regions also are sites of geopolitical conflict, and the development of nuclear weapons can't be separated from the other point you mentioned, which is that the people have this understanding, the leaders have this understanding that nuclear weapons are perhaps their best way to stop being invaded, for instance. We see the same thing with North Korea. We see the Iran nuclear deal, for instance, not progressing at all, which means Iran has also taken certain steps in that direction. So in some senses, the question of nuclear weapons cannot be really addressed in isolation as long as some of these geopolitical issues remain unresolved, for instance, Israel as well.
And I think that's a very important point, that if we want to get rid of nuclear weapons, then there has to be conditions in which the weak countries, those who are militarily much weaker than, for instance, the United States or Russia or China, or for instance, India, for example, those countries then have to give guarantees to others that they will not militarily attack them. Otherwise, the whole idea that nuclear weapons are in some sense an equalizer then gains traction. And as I said, the fact that the conventional weapons were used against, for example, Yugoslavia, and then they were used against Iraq, they were used against Libya by NATO. So all of this gives it, shall we say, the weaker countries an incentive. Then we should then have weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons as an equalizer. And therefore, as you say, that you cannot separate the issue of non-proliferation from also the issue of peace. And this is something which I think is not sufficiently understood, because a lot of the peace movement, particularly in the West, took it for granted that, okay, nuclear weapons are bad, But non-proliferation is a first step towards peace. What they didn't realize that the countries who wanted non-proliferation, who were in fact supporting non-proliferation, were also ones who are unwilling to give even a pledge for no first use. The United States, France, UK, all of them have not given any pledge for no first use. Therefore, to talk of non-proliferation when you are sitting on nuclear weapons and then asking others not to go the same route becomes hypocritical, particularly when no steps for dismantling the nuclear arsenal was taken. You see, when non-proliferation agreement was signed, there was a clause in it which said good faith negotiations for dismantling nuclear weapons. That was also a part of the treaty. Now, the US has said very clearly that it's never going to give up nuclear weapons, at least for the foreseeable future. Now, given that position, that one of the countries who was basically one of the drivers of the non-proliferation treaty said that we are never going to disarm, we're not going to get rid of our weapons, is now on a move to put a new generation of nuclear weapons, refurbishing old weapons, building more and more arms. The US spends more on its military arsenal than the next 12 countries. So given all of that, it's very unlikely that you can now talk about non-proliferation without talking about disarmament. And I think that link, when people want non-proliferation but do not want to talk about disarmament, that's completely hypocritical. The second part of it, which we have also raised, that at least as a first step, can we start getting rid of your weapons and the numbers you have? Because you really need 5,000. You really need 5,500, 6,000, 6,200 nuclear weapons. That's enough to finish the globe about 20, 30 times over. So this kind of steps, I think, are steps which should, at least in the eyes of the people, be okay. We are on the path to peace. And the third, of course, reinstating the issue of the ABM treaty. Right. I think that is a very important element. But you are absolutely right that all of this makes sense also if you talk about how to bring peace in the world, which means the weak must feel that they are not going to be attacked by the strong. And of course, you can argue that Ukraine, Russia shows that Russia also does the same thing. Yes, but the question is, you have to see the context. The eastward expansion of NATO, putting missile batteries really close to Russia in Poland and Romania, possibility of having it even closer, 500 kilometers from Moscow in Ukraine. All of these are part of the larger issue. That's just not nuclear weapons alone that we have to talk about, but really all the other issues, which is what you have raised, the question of disarmament and peace, not simply as nuclear bomb, nuclear disarmament, but also the larger issue of peace, without which you really will not find traction today about the nuclear disarmament issue. That's why telling North Korea that you should not have nuclear weapons, while at the same time, officially, the war still is on, as you know, between North Korea and the United States. We have never had a peace agreement as of date. It's only a temporary truce, the temporary ceasefire that is there.
Absolutely. And not to mention that, I mean, the last time in the last few days, we were all very worried because of Nancy Pelosi's very provocative trip. And we also see that during Donald Trump's time, there were plans to attack, for instance, Iran. And that throws into question, the relative ability of the United States to even carry out a policy which can, which avoids conflict or something, because there seem so many provocations which are being made towards, any of which could lead to one of those miscalculations.
Well, the other problem is the United States seems to be in a state of crisis in which a consensus, forget a global consensus, even a local consensus, meaning within the United States, which is acceptable to the various political parties which can run the United States, that doesn't seem to be on. So you have a fracturing of the global consensus, not only the global consensus, but if you look at the United States, the most powerful country in the world militarily, also the fracturing of an internal consensus. So if there is no internal consensus, that means any president who signs a peace agreement or a peace treaty or anything to do with nuclear disarmament, the next president can come and chuck it out, which is what Trump did. In fact, the original decision to walk out of the ABM treaty was really in the 90s. At that time, Russia was weak, and Yeltsin, if you remember, was in power. He really did not have much that he could have said or done because he had by the time become virtually a puppet in the hands of the United States. So given that scenario, US felt free to walk out of it. This was their century. This was their, they said that now we are going to be the inevitable power and we're going to have the Pax Americana for the next 100 years. That was the kind of vision they had, but it's taken 20 years to bring them back to reality. But the point is that the US has become what is called treaty-incapable, and that's what we saw in Iran. That's what we see also on the other issue of global warming, which has equal possibilities of devastating the world. Both these cases, one president signs a treaty, the other president walks out of it. George Bush, he walked out of essentially of the Kyoto Protocol and whatever had been agreed earlier with respect to global warming. Then we had Obama, who signed the treaty, managed to get US on board, but again, Trump walked out of it. So given the fact that the US is no longer treaty capable, and that's also the Iran scenario, where you had an agreement which actually dismantled a huge number of centrifuges in Iran, and then you have Trump back again withdrawing from it. So you've restarted this whole cycle. So the US not being treaty capable means who does the world or the other nuclear powers negotiate with if the US is going to be one election away from walking out of any agreement that it makes? I think that is the other issue that is there. So therefore, the need for other countries to step in, create a global climate for people all over the world to get together. But really, it is for nations who are not nuclear weapons powers that how they can get together and build up a voice by which it forces the nuclear powers to rethink on the strategy they're adopting. I think that's a real challenge. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki needs to be remembered because that was a wanton destruction. It didn't make any difference to the war as we know. As we know, Japan was going to surrender. They were only negotiating the protection for their emperor, which anyway the West, the United States gave them later on when they surrendered. But it was more to set the scenario for the post-war period that the nuclear bombs were used. As many people have said, they were the first shots of the new Cold War, not the finishing of the Second World War. That's why the nuclear bombs are used. It's a very cynical exercise of using the bombs. I'm not going to go into that history today, but I think it's important for the global committee of nations, particularly the non-nuclear ones, to press all others that we need to give up nuclear weapons. And for that, you need to give guarantees that not only nuclear weapons, but other guarantees that peace will be preserved and war will not be used as a weapon. And I think, and military blocs then need to be dismantled. You cannot have the onward march of NATO invading countries at the same time talk about nuclear non-proliferation and peace. I don't think the two go hand in hand.
Thank you so much, Prabir. It's an ironic and sobering thought that much of Hollywood, for instance, or American fiction focused on some loony dictator gaining control over nuclear weapons, and now we see the possibility that a US leader in the near future could be in a very similar position but cause much, much more damage. Thank you so much. We'll come back with later episodes of Mapping Fault Lines. Until then, keep watching NewsClick.